This episode is brought to you by Amazon. The holidays are here, and you know what that means? It's time to get your friends and family the gifts they deserve. Take the stress out of shopping with Amazon's great deals and low prices on a huge range of items from toys to tech and much more. Whoever you're gifting for, Amazon has great prices on everything you need this holiday season. Shop Black Friday week deals now.
Notorious killer Paul Bernardo faced the Parole Board of Canada for the third time this week. The man convicted in the killing of 3 girls 30 years ago has again been denied a chance at more freedoms. I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. National Post reporter Adrian Humphreys joins me to discuss the pitch the murderer and rapist made in his hearing, why the parole board ultimately said no, and what the families of his victims had to say about the man who took their loved ones from them. Don't forget you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Adrian, for many Canadians, the name Paul Bernardo brings back a lot of terrible memories about some horrific crimes back in the 1990s. But for those listening who may not be as familiar with the name, with his crimes, who is Paul Bernardo and what was he convicted of doing?
For a certain generation of Canadians, and certainly those in Ontario, Paul Bernardo is the absolute boogeyman of stranger crime. He is the quintessential fear-invoking manifestation of evil for normal, regular people. What he did was he was a serial rapist, first of all, very prolific rapist. Throughout parts of Toronto, Scarborough, and then he escalated to murder. So he kidnapped 2 young schoolgirls, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey and 15-year-old Kristen French, about almost a year apart. Snatched them off the street. Him and his wife, Carla Homolka, another notorious name, kept them captive for days, repeatedly sexually abusing them in horrific ways, physically abusing them, sexually abusing them, verbally abusing them. Total humiliation and degradation, killed them, and then disposed of their bodies in despicable fashion. And there was a period of time when we didn't know who committed these crimes, and there was a large police task force, and everyone was terrified of who it could be, and of strangers and cars, and it really invoked a real sense of true public panic. Mm-hmm. And then all of those sort of fears were manifest when his trial, one of the lengthiest and most complicated trials to date in Canada, because he videotaped all the degradation to his victims, and his victims' families were very vocal in their standing up for both the memory and the dignity of their daughters, and it was just an incredibly emotional moment in Canadian judicial history and criminal history, all stemming from the insatiable horror show that is Paul Bernardo.
And so he was not only convicted of these crimes, he was also charged with the death of Homolka's sister as well, correct?
Yeah, so there's 3 killings, 2 for murder, 1 for manslaughter, that makes him officially eligible to be called a serial killer and a serial prolific rapist. And this is Carla Homolka, his wife, drugging into unconsciousness her own underage minor sister for them to sexually abuse. And then, she died, whether, intentional or accidental, seemed to be in some doubt. But in any event, they caused her death. And that's why he's charged with three killings.
And so when we talk about what the justice system had meted out for Paul Bernardo, he was convicted, he was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, life without parole for a certain number of years, and he was also declared a dangerous offender. What do the conviction and the dangerous offender status mean in terms of his incarceration? Well,
a couple of things, of course, is he had multiple offenses in these 3 killings and two first-degree murder cases. But when he was convicted, and we're back in that situation now, but the sentences all happened to take place at the same time. There was none of this, you serve one and have a consecutive sentence to serve the other. So no matter, and this was already a point of contention because, he was convicted for killing Leslie Mahaffey, and he didn't get a lick of other punishment. Not a nanosecond added to his actual sentence for then proceeding to kill another teenage girl, Kristen French. But the indeterminate sentence came from him being declared a dangerous offender. So he had a dangerous offender hearing after his conviction, in which case there was all kinds of additional crimes, from all his sort of the tragedy and hurt that he caused over years, that were charges that were stayed at trial to keep focused onto the killings mainly and the two main victims, and that declared him a dangerous offender, and that just means an indeterminate sentence. Now, indeterminate sentences can be quite fraught, because theoretically it could be 5 years, 10 years, or in this case, there's a minimum of 25, so there was no chance of him getting out or having any sense of parole until those 25. But now the indeterminate sentence can be seen as holding him in longer. There is no end to his incarceration, potentially because of his indeterminate sentence. But it also means at any point now that our 25 years has lapsed, he is eligible for parole, and this gives him the opportunity, which he has taken, to ask for parole.
And so this week, in fact, he had a parole hearing, but it was not his first attempt at it. What happened with his previous attempts at getting release?
So this was his third parole hearing. And his first was in 2018, his second in 2021. Now we're in 2024. So every 3 years, he makes a bid for parole, and we expect him to make another one as soon as he's eligible to do that. Each time he's been refused. The first one was particularly outrageous that he was even asking. The second time, each time he has learned from this previous experience. I mean, he's not a dumb guy. He reads, he studies, he learns, and he tries to use what he has learned to further the next step in his own agenda. And that's certainly something we saw this week, but it's something we also saw at his previous parole hearings.
And so what was his argument at this most recent parole hearing for why he should be released? And was there anything new that we learned about Paul Bernardo from Paul Bernardo in his attempt at parole this week?
He came up with a new explanation for his offense cycle and his offending. And the fact that it was new and novel was it was great concern to the parole board. But basically, he outlined his bad childhood. He was raised in a home with a man that was not his biological father. When his mother left the home to try and reconnect with her old flame, who was Paul Bernardo's father. That man rejected anything to do with Paul, and then his father that had raised him then rejected him as well. And so he said that his father never hugged him, was abusive to him, and was abusive to his mother. He also said that his mother had been sexually abused, both as a youth and throughout this relationship, and that really caused him a lot of damage. And then he attributed his offenses, his attacks, as quote unquote revenge on the world for what the world had done to his mother, and through that onto him and his bad childhood. That is in broad strokes the sequence that he was attributing, but he ties it up into you might uncharitably call psychobabble, but certainly as if he's clearly read psychology textbooks or programming. He's attended programming throughout the prison system about coping and victimization, and he seems to almost have memorized of these passages, and he would completely sort of recitate. It sounded like a recitation of these offense cycles and offender profiles. And in fact, he was called out by the board because he wouldn't naturally speak in the first person. He wouldn't say, I did this. He'd say, you would do this. And one gets. And so he talked all about, factors and fractured self-esteem and low self-esteem and making people lesser thans and use of power and control and overcompensation and exaggerated aggressiveness through internalization and victimization. And of course, when he's talking about victimization, he's never talking about the people he raped and killed. He's talking about himself and his, poor childhood. And to their credit, the parole board sort of called him on a lot of this and said, look, broken homes and parental rejection and even abuse are not unique to Paul Bernardo. And yet Paul Bernardo is somewhat unique to the criminal world. Many people in the population come from broken homes, almost none of whom go on to be a serial rapist and a serial killer. And, of course, he's never at a loss for words, but it's not always clear exactly what he's saying. But he maintained that at the root, he kept saying, I took the victim stance. And his victim stance then led him to exert power and control to compensate for his low self-esteem, and that raping women suppressed those feelings and replaced it with a, quote, high happiness. And the parole board again challenges and says, well, look, your mother was abused by men. How did you take revenge and compensate for that? By attacking women. And his simple answer was, well, I'm not gay. And that was hours and hours of Paul Bernardo talking at his parole hearing.
That's it. Really hard to put into words how to describe that. I guess the parole board did a good job when basically calling him out on that behavior. I mean, for its part, what has the correctional service had to say about Paul Bernardo, the prisoner? Did they have a voice at this hearing about his rehabilitation, about his fitness to go back out into the world?
Yeah, his institutional parole officer, a woman who was sitting a meter away from him at the table for the hearing, gave her report. And Correctional Service of Canada did not support Bernardo's requests for parole or any sort of temporary leave. They said that it's too soon. He recently, a year and a half ago, under much controversy, got transferred from a maximum security prison to a medium security prison in Quebec. And that lowering of security classification was something seen as necessary for him to ever have a chance at parole. People aren't paroled for maximum security into the community. They call it sort of cascading through the security levels. So that caused a lot of concern, not only because the idea of Paul Bernardo ice skating at a prison rink and working on a landscaping crew in the great outdoors was offensive to many people, but also because it suggested he was making progress to something that few people seem to want, and that is him having any sort of freedom. So they said that, look, for decades he was in maximum security. It's only been a year and a half since he's been in medium security. It's far too soon to consider any access to the community. We don't have the work done. He hasn't put the demonstration long enough of how he handles his interaction with the inmates. Because keep in mind, for most of his time in maximum security, he was in solitary confinement. The fear was that the prisoners would kill him, and that strange notion of honor among thieves, or the code of inmate code that looks as poorly upon child molesters as the rest of society does. But he made it out of maximum security, including some integration with the community on his range, and now he's within general population in a medium security, a whole different profile and cohort of prisoners, and he is now, as we heard this week, he is working on this sort of groundskeeping, landscaping crew with other prisoners, and he says he loves it. He's got meaningful friendships and relationships with others, and that he's finally able to see the world outside of his corridor.
We'll be right back. So the Correctional Service doesn't support his attempts at release, and I can only imagine that the families of his victims also very, very much in opposition to Paul Bernardo's release. What was their stance at this hearing, or what do we hear from the families of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey?
Despite the sort of car crash intrigue of seeing Paul Bernardo after all these years, and seeing him now as a 60-year-old man with, just dumpy body and shaggy graying hair and nasally voice, the real impact of this hearing came from the lengthy emotional victim impact statements of his victims and his victims' families. So one of them, Debbie Mahaffey, the mother of Leslie Mahaffey, who he murdered and cut into pieces and encased in concrete and distributed around town, was in the room, not 4 meters away from him, and she made this a powerful statement, not only about all the loss, and the never-ending pain and hurt he caused, but she also presented legal arguments as to why the board shouldn't or couldn't, in her view, release him. But the proximity between them was quite striking. Bernardo never once looked up at her, and he let slip later in the hearing that he was told not, like he did it. He did it because he heard that he shouldn't be intimidating or whatever. It was a calculation on his part not to. Again, adding to this body of evidence that he's sort of calculating his presentation. But then we also heard from a voice we rarely hear in this story, and that's Ryan Mahaffey, who was Leslie Mahaffey's little brother. He was 7 when his sister was killed. And his story, he's now 40 years old, highlighting the passage of time. And he has 2 children of his own. And he's the exact situation now that his mother, Debbie, was when his big sister was kidnapped. And he had spoke very powerfully and very emotionally about that sort of generational trauma. We heard from 2 other relatives of Kristen French, as well as Kristen French's mother, and she also very powerfully spoke of she tallied for the parole board members the number of days it's been that she's had to go without any contact with her daughter, who's now gone, obviously, but also how her daughter had a boyfriend when she was kidnapped, and that man is now a grandfather, and her best friend at the time she was killed is now a grandmother, and yet her daughter never even had the chance to become a mother. And, and these things, it's hard to imagine this didn't have an impact on the board. And they also, by the way, heard from another victim, a sexual assault victim, a woman who was not named. And she was attacked and raped by Paul Bernardo. And she spoke of the terror of him holding a knife to her throat and fearing that at any moment she'd be killed. So it's quite emotional, important to hear. And important to remain on the record, the impact of the crimes of Paul Bernardo.
So with all these arguments against Paul Bernardo's release and this continued view of Paul Bernardo, the person in the minds of Canadians, it would be hard to imagine there being an argument to see him get released. But as he ages and he has the opportunity every couple of years to pursue parole, is there a chance that at some point he could eventually be released from prison? Or would that run counter to the belief that he should spend every waking moment of the rest of his life behind bars?
Well, the whole parole system is built on hope and chances. One of the reasons why the Supreme Court sort of was unhappy, dissatisfied with consecutive sentences is it robbed an offender of any sense of hope that they would ever, if you're facing a 50 or 75, 100-year sentence before parole, well, then that's hopelessness. And so there is some sense of hope that Bernardo clearly maintains. And he has been making progress in the language and criteria of the parole system. Along with not supporting his bid for freedom and parole, the Correctional Service of Canada did tell the board that he has been making progress. He's had no institutional complaints or concerns. He's not been into fights or engaged in sort of the criminal subculture of prison. He's obedient to prison rules, and he comes when he called, and so on and so forth. And he's attending programming. And the argument he makes is that he wants, he's not going to get day parole anytime soon, but he also asked for temporary escorted absences, and he did that for the purposes of further programming and treatment. So, is there a world where, Paul Bernardo, when he's older and had made additional progress and spent more time living with the increased freedom of a medium security, is allowed to go into the community to get treatment and programming? It's entirely a possibility. And I think one of the things that are important in this is, there was a great controversy about the destruction of the videotapes that he took of his offenses, and this idea of will memories fade? Donna French and Debbie Mahaffey won't always be up for traveling to northern Quebec to present a victim impact statement. Mm-hmm. So to get that second generation in there, Brian Mahaffey, who's 20 years younger than Paul Bernardo, and hopefully will outlive Paul Bernardo, and his younger victims, and Kristen French's nieces, who also spoke, to remind future board people who also might have their memory blurred and over 30. Will be next parole appearance will be close to 35 years, and then eventually it might be 40 years after. How well will we remember, the crimes and horror and terror of Paul Bernardo? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it is possible. But everything about him, he is controversial. So, there will be an outcry. There will be a politics of it, as he complains about. He says, "I'm news. I'm always news. They were talking about it in the House of Commons. Everything's political." And the board itself did, and the Correctional Service of Canada, they also sort of mentioned this understanding that there's, they took great pains to say they're arm's length, they're devoid, they're not making a political decision. But that's where we stand, and we'll have to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like a story that, at least for many Canadians, will never go away, but it's one that Canadians will have to reckon with as he ages and attempts to get released at some dates in the future. Adrian, thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much for your interest, Dave. 10-3
is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Adrian Humphreys. More from him at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.